The year 1799, the Rosetta Stone is found. During Napoleon Bonaparte's Egyptian campaign, a French soldier discovered a black basalt slab inscribed with ancient writing near the town of Rosetta.
For more than 200 years, this object has stood in one of the most visited museums on Earth, under a label that suggests everything about it has already been figured out. It hasn't. A dark slab of rock, 3 separate scripts carved side by side, dug up in the middle of a war, passed from one empire to another as a trophy, given the credit for cracking open one of history's greatest linguistic puzzles. But look closer at what the stone is actually made of, at the political chaos surrounding the moment it was carved, at the contradictions buried in its own words, at the disputed story of how it ended up behind glass in London instead of on Egyptian soil. And the tidy version of this story starts to come apart. What if cracking the translation was only step 1? What if nobody ever properly asked a deeper question? What was this stone actually built to do? Who was it built for, and who benefited from it? Let's get into it. The discovery that changed everything. The modern story of the Rosetta Stone starts with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798, one of the oddest military campaigns in European history, remembered as much for the scholarship it dragged along with it as for the fighting. Napoleon didn't just bring soldiers. He brought a commission of sciences and arts, 167 scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers tasked with documenting Egyptian civilization from top to bottom, ancient and contemporary alike. This wasn't a side project bolted onto the invasion. It was part of the plan. Napoleon treated intellectual conquest and military conquest as the same operation, and sending scholars and alongside soldiers was as much a calculated act of cultural seizure as it was genuine curiosity. The eventual result, the description de l'Egypte, stretched to 23 volumes and remains one of the largest documentation efforts European scholarship has ever produced. It was inside that environment that a young officer, Lieutenant Pierre-François Bouchard, was overseeing repairs at Fort Julian near the town of Rosetta in July 1799 when his crew turned up a large inscribed stone in the rubble. That Bouchard recognized it as worth reporting, rather than just leaving it as scrap building material, was itself a product of the scholarly atmosphere Napoleon had built around the whole expedition. The stone went to Cairo, to the Institut d'Egypte, the scholarly society Napoleon had modeled on France's own Institut de France, and its potential as a multilingual inscription was spotted almost immediately. The scholars had made a decision that turned out to matter enormously. Since the stone itself was too heavy to move around easily, they coated its surface in ink and pressed paper against it, producing large printed impressions of the text. Those copies spread through European scholarly circles fast. Researchers across the continent were already working on inscriptions long before the physical stone ever left Egypt. By the time it actually reached British hands, the text had already been circulating for 2 years. The handover from French to British custody happened because France lost the war. When General John Hely Hutchinson's British forces broke French resistance in Egypt in 1801, the fate of France's scholarly collections got tangled up in surrender negotiations. The capitulation of Alexandria, signed by British, French, and Ottoman representatives in August 1801, formally handed the major antiquities over to Britain. But exactly how the Rosetta Stone itself changed hands is still disputed, and the 2 surviving first-hand accounts have never been reconciled. Colonel Tompkins Hillgrove Turner, who oversaw shipping it to Britain, described a straightforward military seizure. He claimed he personally took the stone from French Commander Manu and carted it off as spoils of war. The British scholar Edward Daniel Clarke told a very different story. He said a French officer, worried the stone might be destroyed or lost in the chaos of surrender, quietly led him through back streets near Manu's residence and revealed where it had been hidden among the baggage. In Clarke's version, this was an act of preservation by a sympathetic Frenchman, not a seizure by force. Both accounts can't be true. That contradiction has never been settled, and it says something that even at the exact moment the stone changed empires, the story around it was already being shaped by whoever was telling it. The stone crossed Britain aboard the captured French frigate HMS Egyptian. landing at Portsmouth in February 1802, and was formally handed to King George III as part of Britain's growing imperial collection. Before it went to the British Museum, it was shown at the Society of Antiquaries of London on March 11, 1802, with Turner presenting it, the moment it stopped being battlefield loot and became an object of scholarship. The British Museum later painted an inscription onto its side that's still there today, captured in Egypt by the British Army in 1801. The French, who had produced the first scholarly work on the text, aren't mentioned at all. That omission was its own political statement, permanently attached to the object. The long silence before the key. To grasp what the decipherment actually achieved, you have to understand just how totally the ability to read hieroglyphs had vanished. Ancient Egyptian writing had been in use for over 3,000 years, and at its peak it ran across three related scripts: formal hieroglyphs for monuments, hieratic for religious and administrative writing on papyrus, and Demotic for everyday business in later periods, together one of the most elaborate and long-lived writing systems ever created. The collapse was slow, then abrupt. Once Rome took over from Greek rule after 30 BC, Greek and Latin became the languages of administration. The temples that had trained scribes for generations and kept the knowledge of hieroglyphs alive were gradually squeezed by Roman taxation and eventually shut down when Emperor Theodosius ordered pagan temples closed across the empire at the end of the 4th century AD. The last hieroglyphic inscription ever carved was at the Temple of Philae in 394 AD. The last Demotic inscription there followed in 452 AD. With the temples gone and no one left to train new scribes, the ability to read 3,000 years of writing simply disappeared. What followed was near total silence. Greek and Roman writers who came across hieroglyphs around the era consistently misread them as symbolic pictures rather than a phonetic writing system, and that mistake got scholarly weight behind it in the 5th century AD from a writer named Apollo, whose book Hieroglyphica assigned elaborate hidden meanings to individual signs. Apollo was mostly wrong, but his texts resurfaced in the Renaissance and ended up steering European attempts to read Egyptian writing off course for centuries. Medieval Arab scholars in Egypt got closer to the truth. Figures like Dulnan al-Misri in the 9th century and Ibn Washia in the 10th drew comparisons between hieroglyphic signs and Coptic, the language descended from ancient Egyptian that survived as a liturgical language of the Coptic Church. Ibn Washia's book, Ancient Alphabets and Hieroglyphic Characters Explained, written around 985 AD, contained real insight into how some signs function phonetically. It never reached European scholars, but it shows a hieroglyph to Coptic link, the same link that would later crack the code, had already been partly worked out centuries before Champollion. In 17th century Europe, the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher took a serious swing at the problem and got almost all of it wrong. Kircher genuinely knew Coptic, but he was convinced hieroglyphs were mystical symbols carrying secret meaning rather than a script recording spoken language. His confident, widely published errors stuck around for a long time. The Rosetta Stone changed the whole equation. For the first time, scholars had a parallel text, a language they already knew, Greek, sitting next to two unknown scripts saying the same thing. The path forward was now theoretically clear, even if actually walking it would prove brutally difficult. Early progress was slower than the popular version of the story usually admits. The Greek text was readable, but it was written in dense, period-specific administrative Ptolemaic Greek that came with its own translation headaches. Stephen Weston produced an early English translation of the Greek in 1802, though it was imprecise in ways that muddied later work. Gabriel de Laporte Duthiel and Hubert Pascal of Mailhon produced French translations around the same time, and Richard Porson and Christian Gottlieb Hayne added further analysis. Each pass sharpening the picture, while also exposing how complicated the text really was. Work on the Demotic script moved forward separately. Johann David Akerblad, a Swedish diplomat and Orientalist, picked out proper names in the Demotic text in 1802 by matching them against the Greek. Antoine Isaac Sylvestre de Sacy, one of the top Orientalists in Europe, made similar headway. Both, though, assumed Demotic was a simple alphabet, an assumption that held him back. since it was actually a mix of phonetic signs, logograms, and determinatives, not a pure alphabet at all. Thomas Young, the English physician and polymath better known today for his work on wave optics, made real breakthroughs between 1814 and 1819. He identified the oval cartouches in the hieroglyphic text as enclosing royal names, correctly worked out that some hieroglyphic signs were phonetic rather than purely symbolic, and nailed down several correct sign values. His findings were published in the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1819, which meant they reached a wide audience. His blind spot was assuming phonetic signs were used only for foreign names within an otherwise symbolic system. Jean-François Champollion, a French linguist who had been obsessed with Egyptian scripts since childhood and had deep fluency in Coptic, delivered the real breakthrough in 1822, drawing on a wider body of inscriptions that now included the Abu Simbel temples and the flat obelisk, extra bilingual material beyond just a Rosetta Stone. He proved that hieroglyphic writing was phonetic throughout, not just for foreign names. He laid this out to the Académie des Inscriptions in Paris in September 1822, later published as the Lettre en Azur, and that became the foundation Egyptology has built on ever since. The fight over credit between Young and Champollion turned bitter and stayed that way for decades, with British and French scholarly circles lining up behind their own countrymen in a way that had as much to do with national pride as with the actual evidence. From the moment it was found, the Rosetta Stone seemed to generate disputes over ownership and credit alongside every real step forward. The stone, that was never what it seemed. The first mistake about the Rosetta Stone happened almost the moment it was found. When French soldiers pulled out of the ground near Rosetta in the Nile Delta in 1799, the early paperwork described it as dark basalt, and that label shaped scholarly assumptions about where it came from, what it was made of, and where it fit within Ptolemaic Egyptian material culture. That label was wrong. After the stone reached London and came under the British Museum's care, the treatments it received actually made the misidentification worse. White chalk was worked into the carved inscriptions to make them easier to read for scholars and visitors. A layer of protective wax was applied to shield the surface from constant handling. Over time, those interventions darkened the stone so much that the basalt label survived for more than 100 years, repeated in publications, lectures, and encyclopedias. It took until 1999, 2 centuries after it was dug up, for a careful conservation, cleaning, to strip away those artificial coatings and expose what had been underneath the whole time. The surface wasn't basalt. It was granodiorite, a coarse-grained igneous rock with a natural dark gray tone and faint crystalline glints visible under certain light, plus a thin pink vein running through one corner. That specific mineral signature points to the Aswan region, quarried from an area near the Nile called Gebel Tingar. The material had been telling the truth the whole time. This stone wasn't imported or exotic. It was cut from Egyptian ground that Egyptian craftsmen had been quarrying for millennia. Granodiorite wasn't picked casually in ancient Egypt, either. It's the same stone used for statue of Khafre at Giza, for royal colossi, for objects tied specifically to permanence and divine authority. Choosing it for a priestly decree was itself a statement about how much weight and how much staying power that message was meant to have. Physically, the stone is sizable, just under 4 feet tall, over 2 feet wide, and around 760 kilograms. But what survives is incomplete. It's the bottom portion of a much larger stele, and the upper sections have never turned up, comparing it to a similar monument. The Memphis Decree stele from 238 BC issued under Ptolemy III, with a similarly structured multilingual text, suggests at least another foot of hieroglyphic inscription is missing from the top, along with a kind of royal imagery and divine symbolism typical of formal Ptolemaic monuments. 3 scripts survive on what's left: hieroglyphs at the top, cut off by the break, Demotic in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom, the most complete and best preserved of the 3. Each script spoke to a different social and linguistic group within Ptolemaic Egypt, and that deliberate multilingual layout raises a question popular retellings tend to gloss over. Why write the same decree in 3 scripts unless the audiences reading them were different enough that the message needed to be shaped separately for each one? That question gets a lot more interesting once you understand the political mess that produced the inscription in the first place. The question of what was actually said. Even after Champollion cracked the hieroglyphic system, the argument over the Rosetta Stone's own text didn't stop. It just changed shape. The new dispute was about which of the three inscriptions, Greek, Demotic, or hieroglyphic, was the original that the other two were translated from. That mattered, because whichever version came first would carry the most textual authority and would reveal whose interests actually shaped the decree. Some scholars lean toward Greek being first, pointing to how Ptolemaic government actually worked. The ruling class did its official business in Greek, and formal decrees were typically drafted in the language of the royal court first. Under that reading, the Demotic and hieroglyphic versions were translations made for distribution to the wider population. Others argued the hieroglyphic text carried greater weight, simply because it was written in the sacred script of the Egyptian temple tradition, and that the priests who issued the decree at Memphis may well have drafted it in hieroglyphs first, as a statement of Egyptian institutional authority in its own right. A third view holds that all three versions were written at the same time, each for its own audience, meaning there was never a single original at all, just three parallel versions, each shaped by the conventions of its own script and readership. Today's scholarly consensus, built partly on comparisons with other Ptolemaic decree stelae, like the Canopus and Memphis decrees, leans toward the idea that the three scripts were produced in close coordination, probably with Greek functioning as the administrative base text, while Egyptian scribes adapted it for their own scripts and audiences. But adapted is doing real work in that sentence. The three versions aren't identical. They differ in emphasis, in the honorific titles given to the king, and in how the priestly privileges are described. The differences are subtle, but consistent enough to suggest each version was tuned for the people who'd actually be reading it. The hieroglyphic version, aimed at temple priests trained in Egypt's oldest and most prestigious scribal tradition, frames the king's generosity in explicitly theological terms. The Demotic version, used for ordinary administrative and legal purposes, is more matter-of-fact. The Greek version, aimed at the Macedonian and Hellenized population running the empire, leans into the rational and political side of royal rule. That's not just a difference in translation. It's a difference in how power was being explained and justified to three separate groups within Egyptian society, each with its own needs, its own loyalties, and its own relationship to the dynasty issuing the decree. Read that way, the Rosetta Stone stops being a single unified proclamation and starts looking like a document of managed political messaging. Evidence of fractured empire trying to hold itself together by carefully tailoring the version of royal authority each audience was most likely to accept. The decree that exposed a fragile empire. At the heart of the Rosetta Stone is a decree issued in the name of Ptolemy v. Epiphanes, a king whose real authority, at the time it was written, was almost entirely on paper. Ptolemy V took the throne as a roughly 5-year-old child after both his parents died under circumstances ancient sources describe only carefully. His mother, Arsinoe III, appears to have been murdered in a palace plot shortly after his father, Ptolemy IV, died in 204 BC. Power didn't go to the child king. It went to a rotating cast of court officials and regents who ruled in his name while fighting each other for control. One of them, Agathocles, effectively ran Alexandria for several years until a violent popular uprising in the city ended his grip. Things weren't any more stable outside the palace. The Seleucid king Antiochus III and the Macedonian king Philip V both saw an opening in a child ruler and a divided court and coordinated attacks on Ptolemaic territory across the eastern Mediterranean. The Fifth Syrian War, fought during Ptolemy's minority, cost Egypt significant territory. At the same time, Upper Egypt had been dealing with years of revolts led by local rulers who never fully accepted Greek dynastic control in the first place. Egypt, in other words, was not one unified country. It was split along ethnic, linguistic, and regional lines, ruled in name only by a child from a shaken dynasty under pressure from every direction at once. The Memphis Decree, the name scholars use for the text carved on a Rosetta Stone, was issued in 196 BC at a formal assembly of priests in Memphis, Egypt's ancient religious capital, home to the cult of Ptah, and a city whose ties to legitimate Egyptian kingship went back long before the Ptolemies ever showed up. The priests gathered there weren't just praising a king. They were building a political and religious framework meant to prop up a regime that needed their backing just as much as they needed the king's patronage. The decree itself is tightly built. It lists what Ptolemy V had done for the temples and priesthood, waiving certain taxes, giving grain and silver, funding temple construction and repairs. In return, it confirms his divine status, sets specific religious honors to be paid to him at every temple in Egypt, and orders that the decree be carved onto hard stone Stelaean 3 scripts and put on public display across the country. The text dates events using both the Egyptian and Macedonian calendars, a deliberate move meant to speak to both the native Egyptian population and the Greek-speaking ruling elite at once. But when scholars look closely at those dates, things don't line up. Different parts of the inscription give different dates for the king's coronation. Some point to spring, others to autumn of the same year. Nobody has fully resolved these inconsistencies. They might come from translation slips between the 3 scripts, from political edits made as the text was reworked for different readers, or from something stranger, the deliberate preservation of 2 different versions of events inside a single official document. That last possibility is the one that's hardest to sit with. If the decree really was built to preserve different versions of the same events for different audiences, one story for the priests in hieroglyphs, another for local administrators in Demotic, a third for the Hellenized elite in Greek, then the Rosetta Stone isn't just a royal proclamation. It's a tool of political management written in 3 languages, built not to tell one truth, but to hold together several different versions of the same authority across a deeply divided society at the same time. One decree, split into audience-specific versions, spread across a fractured empire. That a much stranger and more unsettling document than the one usually described in introductory accounts. The legacy of an unfinished story. The Rosetta Stone has sat in room 4 of the British Museum since 1802, one of the most continuously displayed objects anywhere in the world, and one of the most disputed. Egypt has formally asked for it back more than once, most notably in 2003, when Hawass, then head of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, made an international appeal for its return. The British Museum has turned down every request, pointing to founding legislation that bars permanent transfers out of collection. That fight over ownership isn't separate from the questions about what the stone actually means. It's the same argument that's followed it since the day it was found. The popular version of this story treats the Rosetta Stone as a resolution, a mystery solved, a language unlocked. And Champollion's breakthrough really did open up access to thousands of years of recorded history. That part is true, and it matters. But the fuller story is Messier, a stone quarried in Egypt, carved to record an Egyptian priestly decree, got misidentified for 200 years, taken as spoils of war, credited according to whichever nation scholars were telling the story, and has been displayed ever since under the name of the empire that seized it rather than the civilization that made it. Look closely at its text, and it turns out to tell 3 subtly different stories depending on which script you're reading. Built by those in power, distributed strategically, shaped to mean something slightly different to each audience it was aimed at, not to unify the truth, to manage it. That was true of a decree cut into stone in 196 BC. It's worth asking what it says about every official text any authority has ever put out, when they needed people to believe something badly enough to carve it in stone. If this changed the way you think about who gets to control the stories we tell about the past, like and subscribe. History is never as settled as the museum labels want you to believe.